Hello and welcome to ATARC's webinar series. Today, topic experts will share strategies that agencies can implement to alleviate the concern of the unknown and make operations more efficient. My name is Kirsten Kotzarupa, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's panel discussion. ATARC stands for the Advanced Technology Academic Center, and ATARC is an organization that facilitates collaboration through government, industry, and academia in order to accelerate technology modernization initiatives. ATARC provides ongoing opportunities for cross-agency collaboration through on-site interaction, learning, and market research. Welcome to all of our attendees, and a special thanks to Amy Keller, Maddie Lang, and the entire Beyond Trust team for making today's event possible. Before we begin, I want to encourage the audience to please submit questions of your own in the Q&A section of this platform, and also be sure to answer the poll questions as they come up throughout today's discussion so that you can receive your CPE credit. Now I'd like to welcome all our panelists to come on camera. Looks like they all are here, and go ahead and come off mute because we're going to begin with a round of introductions. So if you could please share with us who you are, what your role is, and what agency or organization you are with today. If we could begin with Ross Ford, do you mind getting us started, please?
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks a lot. I'm Ross Ford. I currently am a contractor with the Department of Interior. I should say I'd be speaking on my behalf, not on their behalf today. Many of you know that I recently retired from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and much of what I'll talk about today will be, colored by my experience with them.
Great, thank you. Let's go to Roman next.
Hello, my name is Roman Kulbashny. I'm from Department of Education. I'm leading security engineering and architecture for the department, and under me there's a few strategic programs that kind of like in the scope of this discussion. ICAM and Zero Trust, as well as continuous monitoring. That's what I oversee, and really looking forward for our conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. Natasha, let's hear from you.
Hi, thank you for having me. Natasha Ibrahim. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm with the Maryland Department of Labor's Family and Medical Leave Insurance Program. I'm the head of products, so my role is a little bit different. I'm a more of a generalist, but of course, these issues are really central to how we're thinking about standing up the system. So I'm excited to participate.
Great, thank you. And let's go to John next. John, I think you're on mute if you're trying to say anything right now. All right, let's go to Christopher. We'll come back to John.
Thanks, Kirsten. Hello, everybody. Chris Hills, Chief Security Strategist with Beyond Trust. We are a privileged access management and identity security vendor. I've been in the identity space since I got out of the military, naval aviation in 2002. And I've been directly involved with privileged access management since 2011, hands-on from the practitioner world. And almost now 6 years ago, changed gears, and now I'm on the vendor side of the house.
Awesome, thank you. Let's try John one more time. If not, we will come back to him later. John, are you there?
This is John Brett. How's it going?
Good.
Yeah, I've been doing ICANN for the last 10 years. I was a DoD Army. Now I work for the IRS, working on the PIN integration for the IRS.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Do you want to kick us off with our first question that I'm about to propose to the panel?
Go ahead.
Sure. Okay. So this is around the modern threat landscape, and it's specific for agencies. So if you could talk from your perspective, how is the modern threat landscape changing and managing identities and privilege? Are there any specific pain points that you've recently seen or experienced in your role?
So most of the stuff that's happening is more internal threats to the systems and the capabilities. So it's more the same, but we try to be more proactive and have those mitigations in place. before anything happened. But it's just typical vulnerabilities that we're trying to approach. But there's a lot of new tools out there that would enhance productivity and security. So yeah, when it comes to privileged access, we're just trying to make sure that whoever has any superpower or admin rights has the right information and some limitations within their accessibility. So we can't just give everything to one single person. Everything has to be distributed and make sure that it's oversight.
Yeah, well, thank you for kicking us off there. I'd love to expand upon that a little bit more, but maybe another panelist could weigh in. Ross, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah,
Okay.
one of the things that I see is, that as agencies operate in an increasingly digital world, that they have more exposure, more applications are exposed to the internet. They have more different kinds of users accessing their environments. This includes, partners and citizens. And in all of those things, we need to be very careful about, first of all, that we know the people that we are letting into our system. So that's the identity proofing part of this, and then the authentication part of it. And then even beyond just simple identity proofing and knowing who that person is, we need to consider, who are what role do they have in the organization, particularly for, either contractors or employees working in the environment, or partners that access these environments. You need to really try to understand, exactly who those people are, what jobs should they have, and try to move towards, in the zero trust architecture world, towards something we call least privilege. I mean, I'll just say least privilege is it's an aspirational goal. It's not, you're not really able to get to the point where you least privilege. It's really hard to do that, but to try to limit people's access to match the thing they're trying to do. I also want to say that one of the things that complicates all of this is, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit later about artificial intelligence and machine learning, but adversaries are using those techniques to impersonate, digital individuals accessing systems. And that is one of the new changing landscape that agencies have to consider. And I'd say the other pain point that, following what John said, a lot of the challenges we have is internal systems, right? So the environments we built generally have been legacy environments, is what I call them. They were, a strong perimeter with kind of access control that was fairly broad once you got inside that perimeter. And then this leads to some vulnerabilities that have been around a long time, as John said, right? It's more of the same, but that we have to pay increasingly sharp focus on the things that the adversaries are doing, because they're able to use things like AI machines to help them script access or script, taking a privileged position in your environment.
Thank you, Ross. Roman, is there anything that you'd like to add based on what's been shared so far?
Well, my addition actually will be echoing what previous panelists said. So we, at least in federal government, we live through that cloud first, crowd smart initiative. So we established our presence in clouds. About half of our portfolio of the system and department is multi-cloud at this point. So that's create that architecture where you have multiple identity providers, maybe different access management systems under umbrella of one accreditation boundary. So our world kind of especially in the areas of identity and access management, get more complicated. There is a more machine-to-machine communications. In many cases, they are very privileged in nature. And on top of that, so from the external actor perspective, so we have, like, decade ago, we have, we kind of recognize that we attacked in very organized way, right? nation states do that, organized international crime organization do that. Now we see that these organizations deploy artificial intelligence in scale. And guess what? They are not regulated by any of the government regulations and laws and circulars and standards. They're ahead of us. So let's face it. So we are now we have now we're being attacked by in many cases well-managed artificial intelligence entities. So back to you.
Great, thank you. And Natasha, I'd love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, sure. I think that, Roman, you bring up something that's so critical, especially in the benefits space, something that we're thinking about a lot. So I'm working in paid leave in particular, which is a trust model, which means that employers pay into the trust and we pay out benefits to the people who need access to those benefits, right? It's very similar to unemployment insurance, and we're able to learn a lot from the history of unemployment insurance and fraud mitigation in the unemployment insurance space. And one of the things, of course, the big shifts that has happened over the past, since the pandemic is maybe due to increased detection, but in general, an understanding that a lot of the highest risk is coming from organized crime and external actors taking advantage of these systems. And so navigating sort of the tension between how do we provide access to the system for people who need access and prevent and detect bad actors before they're able to compromise the program integrity of the program, it's a very real tension. But I think that this is where sort of modern agile development practices become really critical. Our ability to sort of detect where bad actors are coming in and shift and change the way in which our system works quickly to prevent those bad actors, or prevent the sort of the patterns, make those patterns, introduce friction that can block those patterns for short periods of time or long periods of time. So it really is about service design in a lot of ways. But again, I think on top of that is measuring where those risks are. When you're looking at international actors, does it make sense for us to put all of our program funds into enforcement, right? And trying to pursue those bad actors legally? Does it make sense to put our program funds in that space, or to really focus on how those bad actors are getting in the beginning? And so it's all sort of just about risk management. So I think, again, going back to like what has changed in the landscape, the big things that have changed, obviously, we're really aware of these international actors, AI, synthetic identities, and all of this. Another thing that I'm very excited about that's changing in the landscape is I think there's been a really massive increase in cross-state and cross-government collaboration and conversation, so that we can work together across agencies, especially in the government, across agencies, and increasingly, I hope, between the federal and state, to improve resources and share learning as we learn more and adapt to how these bad actors are interacting with our systems.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that perspective. And I know we've been hearing from the agency side, so I want to kind of pass the mic over now to industry and hear from Christopher. Anything you want to touch on based on what's been shared, but also if you could, with the different types of privilege abuse that can occur and that we're currently working to help eliminate in the context of that first question.
No, that's great. And I think Ross hit on some points. There are some other points hit. One of the biggest things that's changed really with the digital identity, as was brought up, right? The shift from the pandemic, if you will, we all rely on the digital identity now, and our identity really has become that network boundary. And the problem that really has with this shift in the digital identity world is that because we're so reliant on these identities, there's so many more things that are associated. We have privileges, we have MFA, we have SSO, we have governance, we have access management. What rights do we have with that account, or maybe with other privileged account? What standing rights does that have? And so what happens is that in this world of digital identity that we're all so reliant upon, now zero trust is coming in, because now we have to verify. We have to ensure that all these different connections, whether it's third parties, whether it's vendors, whether it's the insider, maybe even a malicious insider, as exposed to an external threat coming in. How do we validate that? And the problem we're really seeing in this shift is that all of these different disciplines that fall within the identity fabric house, if you will, the IGAs, the access managements, the MFAs, the SSOs, and everything that requires all these workflows to work and manage digital identities, they're managed in silos. And so when you start thinking about the silos, we start being blinded by the visibility that we get. Where's the misconfigurations? Where's the overprivilege? How are we applying least privilege in this aspect, if you will? And so it provides a unique approach and a challenge to agencies and organizations is how do we wrap our head around that? How do we apply zero trust and get all of these solutions working together to achieve that zero trust architecture? And that really has been where this shift is. And so a lot of it comes around not only the management of those digital identities, the management of the privileges, and it doesn't have to be human. It can be non-human, as mentioned earlier, where all of these machine to machines are talking. Now we have cloud. And when we start talking about the synthetic identities, the deep fakes that are now coming into the world, it provides a whole new proving ground for threat actors to capitalize, as we've seen throughout the year with the breaches. And it really has shifted this landscape. So for us, it falls back on not only managing, but having that identity first focus, but also the visibility. Where are all of those risks at? How do I contain all of those risks and really start driving home, our risk reduction in that aspect?
Thank you, Christopher. And while I have you here too, I think I'd like to ask for you to kind of break it down for our audience, what we mean when we say paths to privilege, and how are attackers targeting those paths to undermine security?
No, and that's a great question. One of our big, we'll call it a promotion, we'll call it a campaign. We talk about paths to privilege, and ideally, when you go back and you look at the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain, the anatomy of an attack, how an attacker must go through. We saw it pre-COVID. There was an insider threat, an external threat, and COVID actually moved that remote worker into a trusted external threat now coming in, which provided a huge playground for threat actors to kind of shift their movement and target the end users, which really is now where their target is, because it's proven to be much easier to log in rather than hack in when it comes to the threat actors. It's quicker, it's faster. Humans, for lack of better terms, I think one of the statistics is 95% of breaches are a result of human error. But when we start thinking about the anatomy of an attack, ideally when an attacker comes in, they land that beachhead and then they start probing for more access. So when we start leaning into the path to privilege, we start to refer to as attackers think. They think in graphs. And so ideally, that path to privilege refers to routes, connections, or even methods that can be exploited to gain access to privilege. They can include misconfigured identities, maybe exposed secrets, legacy systems that we heard about, and so much more. OAuth authentication or OAuth, service principles that may lie in there if we want to talk about Midnight Blizzard, right, if you will. But at the end of the day, it's not just about the privileges themselves, but understanding how attackers will leverage those privileges to move across the system laterally or domains to then escalate their access. So when we start really understanding that least privilege model that all of us want to believe that we're following, when an attacker looks at when I compromise an identity or I compromise, some form of certificate and I gain access, what does that identity, that privilege have access to, and what can I compromise and continue that path throughout the organization, whether it starts in a development domain and gains access into a corporate domain, whatever that may be, or maybe it's that user that's using a compromised endpoint that is making a connection into an environment, whether that's a third party, whether that's a vendor. We see the supply chain issues. All of those pieces provide those paths to privilege. And that's really what we're focusing on. How do we reduce that? How do we take an approach? One of the things that I'll say that I coined is that, security solutions don't replace, bad behavior, or let's say human error. But what it can do is it can help reduce the risks that humans can, let's say, inject into, right? If somebody clicks on something that maybe is a phishing email, or somebody has over privileges and they don't realize it, and they have a bad password, or they're not using a good complex password, or something that's easy, or maybe they're even sharing their password from their personal devices into their corporate systems, and that gets compromised. How can we reduce that blast radius and make sure that the paths to privilege don't lead to a compromise to something bigger within an organization?
Yes, thank you for breaking that down for us. I'm going to call for a quick poll question. Poll question number 1. This is again for our audience. If you would like to receive your CPE credit, be sure to respond to this poll question. It's up on the screen now, which is, how confident are you in your organization's ability to identify hidden paths to privilege, ways to compromise identities, and misuse privilege? So please take a moment to respond to that. And then moving right along, I want to talk about zero trust a little bit. So whoever from our panel would like to weigh in first, you can just kind of like use the raise hand icon or get my attention somehow. But my question is going to be, because zero trust is, of course, an important aspect of security, what is the relationship between zero trust and protecting paths to privilege? Ross, please go ahead.
So when we were describing the paths to privilege, one of the things that came to mind is that, in the NSTAC zero trust paper, and John Kindervag talks a lot about this, is one of the things you want to do when you're developing a zero trust architecture is really closely related to doing this path to privilege, right? You're going to identify a system that you want to be your target of doing doing your privileged access management, finding the boundaries of that system. And then the next step of determining what that protect surface is going to be, you're going to map the data flows, right? And it's really very similar to how the adversaries is going to map their flows of accessing your system, right? Because they are going to get in, they're going to try to find out, once they're in whatever path, right? Is, as I mentioned, some very simple, maybe a password spraying gives them access at a low user level. Then once they're in there, they're going to try to move laterally or move vertically, right? So they're going to try to find another place that they can use a security principal. They can, if they're on the internal network, use Kerber roasting. If they're on a cloud service, they're going to try to find an OAuth token that is a service account, not a limited token, and they're going to escalate those things, right? So the whole point about doing the zero trust is you try to determine what the policy enforcement points are, how you can actually disrupt the user making transitions either laterally or vertically through permission escalation or through just lateral movement. And then that's how you design your policy enforcement points, or you're gonna determine what tools do I have that I can make the adversary in this case, have to do something that is harder for them to do, but make it easy for the people that are intended to get in, because you'll have the right controls set up for them, doing things like making sure they're coming from a device that you trust, come from a location you trust. They're using a stronger authentication, so they did two-factor authentication, so it's difficult for the adversary to use just his password to go anywhere, because you're validating at the policy enforcement points that the person has two-factor authentication. So I think they're really closely aligned, right? Is that the paths to protection are similar to the way the adversaries are trying to find paths of vulnerability.
Yes, thank you, Ross. Natasha, did you want to share anything?
Yeah, I think that, everything, Ross, that you say, of course, makes perfect sense. When you're, looking at a big system, there's just sort of like these blanket ways to think about zero trust. I think that the thing that I continually try to emphasize is that there's not just like adversary. It's not just like big capital letters adversary. There are many different types of adversaries trying to access systems from different perspectives and different angles. So, for some systems, maybe that's an internal system for an agency for staff to be able to perform functions they need to perform to do their job. For some systems, they are providing public access to resources that are really critical to people, you know, and we're talking about sometimes people who are in vulnerable situations. So striking that balance is really important, and understanding who we are talking about when we're talking about adversaries. And this is the struggle that I have had the most, is asking people, who are you talking about when you're talking about adversaries? Because the solution and how we talk about zero trust is going to be different in each situation, right? Like the actual solutions. So yeah, I mean, I totally agree with everything you say, Ross. I do think that we need to increasingly think about basically having user personas for who our adversaries are, right? And thinking about it through a human-centered design. I think that human-centered design has become it's sort of like a new buzzword, but really thinking about, you know, designing our systems, knowing who our users are, knowing who our adversaries are, as we build them out and support them and make changes to them over time.
Yeah, that kind of makes me think of a question that was submitted over here in the Q&A section from Ahmed, which is, where is the boundary line between a bad actor and then those who abuse their cyber privileges? Do you have anything else to say about that from Ahmed sharing?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that, you know, sometimes it's very clear, this is a bad actor. This isn't from an international organization. Sometimes it's someone who's already in the system who's like fudging something. I've heard in the fraud space, I've heard this referred to as like fraud versus fudge. You know, you're doing something to your benefit. Maybe you're abusing your privilege a little bit to get something to go your way. But yeah, I think that it's really critical to be thinking along those lines.
For
And
sure.
prioritizing how you're thinking about zero trust, prioritizing what parts of your system you're focusing on based on the degree of impact, right? Because we're not going to solve for all bad actors ever. Like, that's just a very idealistic thing to say, but we do have to be really strategic in how we're thinking about that and what we're prioritizing.
Roman, would you like to weigh in next?
Sure. So I have couple thoughts I wanted to share. Well, for us, identity was one of the always the most important pillars in the zero trust model. Happened to be we start this network because that's where we was able to leverage enterprise services to deploy this fast and build on top of that, enabling that solutions that we implement, specifically SASE, to enable that being identity aware for applying the policy. But interesting, when you're talking about a zero trust model, if you're looking, there is definitely understanding there. There's definitely, you can get understanding that when you start like from the traditional model and like you progressing to optimal, the privilege, if you look this model, like you will notice that in the privilege description of the privilege, in optimized level of the zero trust, the privilege concept like disappears. So you start talking about all users acting in the system, and you have full awareness of what they do, what they should do, how they should do that, and you're giving them access just in time, just for what they needed to do. So it's actually kind of interesting. When we're talking about users of the systems, there is definitely will be misuse or abuse, either intentionally or not, to able to detect that and interrupt that, and put the users of the system on the path to get to their normal behavior. So that is the one thing that we are also do, like in our ICAM systems. We have automated ways to disconnect, disable access, and put the people who either forget do their security awareness training or identify that they are susceptible to the phishing attacks okay, getting something that they shouldn't do, and they have the privileged access. We're detecting that, and we automatically put them in the position to take training to get more aware and to be less prone for the mistakes, the human mistakes. So what Christopher was saying that there's mistakes will be happening. Absolutely agree with that. We need to limit surface. We need to limit what people can do, but also we can modify the behavior of the individuals as well. So,
Yeah, thank you. And John, is there anything else you'd like to add before we move on to
Yeah,
our next?
when it comes to the path to privilege, it's more about minimizing the risk when it comes to cybersecurity. So users and devices, we just gotta make sure that when they have again access to anything, we minimize the risk. But the elements for that is just identity verification, what we're doing right now with MFA, YubiKey, and so on, and then least privileged access when trying to give the minimal access level to the users' all devices, and also continue monitoring. Where we have to make sure that we understand the user devices behaviors in order to make sure that we minimize the risk internally and externally for those resources. And also microsegmentation is a big topic right now where we have to make sure we make small segments of the applications or services that we provide in order to minimize the risk and any type of uh, cyber threat or insider threat when it comes to those services and users. And like Russ pointed out, policies, but the policies have to be dynamic in order to comply with the zero trust approach. So those are the things that I'm thinking about when it comes to implementing zero trust. To me, my opinion, we're never gonna reach optimal. Optimal is the utopia to reach, but we have to get an advanced level where we know that everything's gonna work.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to call for poll question number 2, and then we're going to talk about some best practices. So poll question number 2 is up on the screen for our audience. Again, please respond to this to receive your CPE credit. What strategies does your organization use to mitigate the risks associated with compromised identities and escalated privileged access? So now going back to our questions that we prepared, I want to talk to our panelists about more specifics around best practices or fundamentals for protecting your paths to privilege. So anything that you've implemented at your own agency or you've seen implemented. We don't have to go in any particular order. So whoever would like to jump in, just let me know. Who would like to go first? Ross, go ahead.
So in the program I did at CISA, just recognizing that you need to use other techniques of managing privileged users than just the normal way to manage users was a really big, important step we took across the federal civilian executive branch, right? The normal management of users, particularly in the legacy environment, really, didn't cut the mustard, right? There was too easy to do privilege escalation, too easy to do lateral movement. And although we really tried to rely on this smart card, for strong authentication, after the person was logged in because of the way that network's designed, moving around laterally and escalating privileges is way too easy, right? So we had to introduce other tools, PAM tools, right, to really provide another layer of security for, where you couldn't do the smart card authentication, you couldn't do strong authentication to the endpoint, you had to do some other method to ensure that the credentials that privileged user was using were short-lived, right? They were unique to that application, and that was kind of the table stakes we went into, the Privileged Access Manager project with.
Thank you. And Natasha, I saw your hand go up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that, data minimization is really important. Just we should be collecting as little as possible and holding on to as little data as we possibly need. So sort of leaning in heavily on that, especially as, running the system for a social benefits, for a benefits platform, it's tempting. Sometimes there's a lot of policy pressure to collect a lot of data, but we want to collect as little as possible. I think also, I can list off sort of the academic strategies, but I think that, thinking as a program about what our principles are and where we want to focus our energy, we made the decision we're not going to rebuild ICAM. I am not going to build custom ICAM. We have ICAM tools that are broadly available, both through the federal government and through the private sector that are, very capable of helping to support us when it comes to two-factor authentication and identity management. And coupling that with least privileged access, of course, always. And least privileged access is and data minimization are so critical because, those principles, you can really embed them on both sides of the system, when you're thinking about, even everything from how our deployment pipelines are built and access to, direct access to our databases for our engineers and DevOps. Least privilege access is really critical there. But when you're also thinking about our public users and what types of access to information and to their own identities they have at a given time, and what we ask of them to make sure that they are the person who should be accessing that information is really critical. So I think those two principles are sort of at the core of everything we think about. The third principle, and I mentioned this earlier, is being agile. I think it's really important because the risks and the adversaries change and move, and they change the way that they're interacting with your system because they find, as you're trying to increase access for the public or for your own teams and making sure that they're able to use and access the system, the adversaries are actively sort of honing in on those. So the ability to make adjustments to detect, bad actors in the systems and make adjustments to how your system is built is absolutely critical. So I don't think, people talk about the role of being agile, being able to change your system and your code base within hours if needed. People don't talk about that as like a core principle for zero trust and for the prevention of bad actors. But I think we should talk about it more because they're moving faster than we are most of the time, especially in government.
Thank you. Yeah, are there any other unique perspectives on the panel that?
So I will be. It's interesting. I think I need to talk with Natasha more because I was thinking agile. Agile was thinking slightly different different layers. So I'm from CFO level agency. So we have complexity, and what we're talking about, we're talking about modernizing and doing the organizational changes, right? That going both on more technical side, changing of approach, how we're building, providing the services, and also how we're managing that across the organization. So we found that the good agile practice in building your policy standards that can align with your technical capabilities and going the opposite direction is very important because something that we are talking about as a problem did not exist last year. Last year, we also did not have technical capabilities to meet certain objectives. So we needed to constantly working on that. And sometimes we do find ourselves outdating standards, preventing us to innovate. Literally, that sometimes we have the standards that going opposite to what zero trust telling us. Many people in the federal government know some of the standards that we have associated with NIST controls are kind of conflicting in many cases. So I will say that being agile in how you're introducing required changes in your services, your systems, in your business processes, because that's required happen too. Yes, that's very important. So that from me. Thanks.
Thank you, Roman. Okay, anyone else? John or Christopher?
Yeah, I think one of the main topics that we need to talk about is governance, because Chris pointed that out earlier. Governance, when you make sure that you do the provision and the provisioning process for customers or employees within enterprise services, where the policies implemented for that in process, or is make sure that we deny access when the person leave or coming in, for limiting the access to a particular person. So that's part of the governance. We got to make sure that the provisioning and the provisioning process is in place in order to give access or limited access to the particular user that trying to get admin rights or any other type of access to the data. So governance is big when it comes to ICANN, but industries are I mean, agencies are learning, and industries are there to help us out. So it is good that we partnered up with the industries.
Absolutely. Okay, I see a hand up, Natasha.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to touch on what John was saying, because I think governance is a huge topic that would be absolutely interesting. Like, we could have a whole panel just on governance, especially because I think that depending on where you are in an organization, are you the CIO or are you the system owner? Are you the one who's actively trying to leverage the governance put in place by a CIO or a CISO? Or are you, the one setting those guidelines? Governance is a double-edged sword. It has a place, it's important, and it's necessary, but it needs to be coupled with feedback loops and facilitation to make sure that it's not actually hindering the security of the systems. I think that access management is a really good example of this. I've seen examples of where, it can take days to get an account disabled. And that's frightening. And that's because the governance is there, but the resources are not there to actually, implement quick responses where quick responses are needed. So as a system owner, sort of further down the chain, under the weight of that governance, I have to be thinking about how to make sure that my systems are safe, knowing that other entities I'm dependent on may not have the resources to provide that all of the time.
Thank you. All right, and then to wrap us up here, Christopher.
Awesome. Thank you. There's a lot to unpack here, that, a lot of good things that are brought up. I do want to touch on one thing that Natasha brought up, right? We talk about detection. And while I'm not saying that detection is bad, good, indifferent, detection is needed. But one of the things I think we forget about is when it comes to prevention. Identities at its core, if we are not looking at the preventative steps to protect those identities, and we're only detecting when something bad happens, or an overprivilege or a threat actor or some type of compromise, that in itself means that it's already happened. We've already been breached. We've already been compromised. So what are we doing to take a proactive approach when it comes to identity, security, as John mentioned, governance? All of these pieces are critical in understanding and protecting, and then it leans into the zero trust model. At the end of the day, I think all of us, look, I'm an engineer at heart. If I have excessive privileges, it's a convenience factor. If somebody needs something done, they know I have access, whether I should have access or not, they're going to come to me. Why? Because they don't want to go through, as what Natasha said, all of the processes in order to get it done. Hey, can you do this? It'll take 2 minutes versus 2 weeks to go through. And so ideally, at the end of the day, that happens more often than not. Engineers, architects, they will take advantage. Whether, again, it's not malicious, but it is a misuse of privileges by users. And so embracing in that zero trust architecture, as Ross had mentioned, the smart cards. I think there's a big misconception that people have is, hey, we want to implement these tools, but we want it to be frictionless. Well, wait a minute. They can't be completely frictionless. Users need to change their behavior and how they operate, because we have to create friction in order to stop the bad actors from compromising our organizations and our agencies. So that means that we have to go through, and as Ross mentioned, the smart cards, that, we had to kind of change our way that we had to do things. And people truly need to understand that in order for us to protect against the modern threats, the modern identity threats, and everything that's associated with that, the list goes on. we have to take a different approach in how, one, we authenticate, and two, how our authorizations, once we're authenticated, gives us access or gives us our path to privilege in a least privilege model. So we can do just the amount that we need to do, or going back to what John said, right? Just in time. Maybe I don't have those privileges, but maybe there's a process that will grant those just at the time that I need them in order for me to accomplish a job, a task. And then once I'm done, those privileges go away. There's no standing privileges. And then we fall within that governance model. There's no standing privileges. There's no excessive privileges. And we can truly be more compliant when it comes to regulatory or even a governance standpoint. And I think that's a big misconception that people have. If we are not looking at the preventative steps of how we're protecting those identities that are related to privileges, that are related to those passive privileges, we are falling behind. We have to take a preventative approach, because if we're solely relying on detections, it's too late. It's already happened. And I'm a huge advocate for that.
Thank you. Natasha, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to follow on to say that, like, you know, I completely agree. I think that prevention is really the key. And again, you know, I keep going back to, I think that something that we don't talk about enough is how this really is a service design problem, right? It's not, you know, data analytics can help a lot with detection, but we have to be thinking about how people are entering the system and how they're moving through the system. That's service design. And I'm really eager to sort of continue talking about the need to bring that perspective to it, the perspective of service designers, thinking about, you know, who are our users, who are our abusers, how are they entering the system, who are the people who are unintentionally compromising the system, and how you know, how is information moving from one end to the other. So yeah,
thank you all for that discussion. I'm going to call for our third poll question that'll be up here on the screen, which is, what are your organization's top identity security priorities for the future? So poll question number 3 is up on the screen now. And gosh, I think we have time for one last question, but I want to make sure we have time for wrap-ups. So just briefly, we'll just take a few comments here from the panel, but it's the question is, does AI play a role in identity? So everyone raise your hand if you agree. And we'll take a couple comments on that. John, I see your hand up. Do you want to comment on that question?
Yes, it is a big role, but we have to make sure how do we implement it. We're not planning to reduce human workforce. The AI is to enhance human workforce. I mean, human capabilities and effort, and be more efficient. AI is to make sure that we have human behind those bots, or whatever we try to implement with baseline AI baseline.
All right, thank you. Christopher, go ahead. You're muted.
I got caught by the mute button. Yes, you know, I love the AI question, and yes, it's, you know, important. I did see a question come through though in the Q&A part from Michelle Thomas, and I love that question. She basically asked, isn't everyone essentially a privileged user? We are to trust no one. So wouldn't you agree that there is no more privileged user? And 2, what are privileged to use anything from network or applications? You are 100% right. I truly believe that the account and the user ID that you log onto your computer with should be considered a privileged user. And I really believe that this is where SSO, MFA, as Ross had mentioned earlier, ensuring that those are enabled in those pieces. So that way you are taking that kind of that zero trust approach, and you're verifying before you're granting or authorizing that access. So I wanted to make sure I answered, or at least brought that up. But AI is huge. I think one of the biggest things when we start thinking about AI is the guardrails. There's no guardrails around it. Whether we look at the breach from Samsung and the 2 engineers that use ChatGPT for, you know, a config file, and next thing you know, that led to a compromise. I think a lot of the end users are under a misconception that, you know, AI is good. And I think from an agency perspective, it's a very hard task when it comes to identity and even privacy. What data is being used? And yes, you know what? You can block it, but guess what? I have an iPhone, I have an iPad, I have a personal computer. If I want to use AI, I'm going to use it. So I really believe that when it comes to the usage of AI, and as it relates even to identities, that we need to give more awareness training. We need to do more training and awareness around what are the implications of leveraging and using AI. What should you put into AI, or what should you be aware of? And I think that's part of the problem. I know a lot of organization agencies have usage, policies around it, but I think it really is around educating the end user of what they're using it for, how they're using it, and what data is actually being put into it that can be regurgitated and then potentially leaked or leveraged from a threat actor perspective.
Thank you, Christopher. Ross, was your hand up earlier?
It was. I was going to answer Michelle as well. And one thing that I think is a barrier, Michelle, to treating every user on a scaler, right, is that so many systems are still built with default global or universal access rights, right? You know what I mean? All the operating systems either have an administrator or root, in it. They're controlled by a password in most cases, right? So I think, that's going to be one of the challenges in the zero trust implementations, is to really move from a default no access and then build the access. That's how you're going to build access to get to your least privileged access controls, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you don't want to stop people from getting on either, Natasha. That's the other side of the coin, right?
You segued perfectly into what I was going to touch on. Yeah, I mean, I think that everything that Christopher touched on, and Ross as well, is top of mind when we're thinking about systems and how our staff are leveraging AI in ways that could be frightening. And providing the education is really difficult. At the same time, increasingly in the identity space, there are a lot of questions about how AI is being leveraged by threat actors, and how it's being leveraged or could be leveraged by, for data analysis, and for us to be able to do the detection. I know we want to be doing the prevention, but of course, I completely agree. We need to prevent first. But we have to keep reminding ourselves, right now, the way that ICAM is working, and when we're going and looking at biometric, there are just strong biases that prevent people who need access to systems from getting access to systems based on race and gender. Those still continue to persist. I strongly believe that we should not use those tools because there are gaps in those tools, but we need to continue improving them so that we are not blocking people based on those criteria. But when you look at things, for example, if you're doing a match against a phone number, right? In tools that I'm not going to name companies, but there are certain companies where you match against a phone number to see sort of, how long has that phone number been in use and things like that. And they'll return a risk score based on the phone number of that individual. And a lot of that is really biased, because if you're looking at individuals, for example, who have to change phone numbers regularly for socioeconomic reasons, it's harder for them to get access to those systems. So again, when you're looking at the way that the public is trying to access systems that they need access to, right? And it's not just the public, it's also our staff as well. When you're thinking about how, supporting staff that, may have disabilities, so on and so forth, we have to think about access holistically, right? It can't just be about preventing access. It's about preventing access for the people that we're most concerned about. When you introduce AI into the picture, right? All of the sort of subcategories of AI is this big umbrella, but when you start looking at the subcategories of AI, it continues not only to reflect the biases that are already built in the tools that we're already trying to use, but amplify them and do it into a black box. I do not think AI is the problem. I think that humans, we have to keep thinking about the people who need to use our systems and access our systems, and balance that with the risk continually. That's a constant process. That's not once at the beginning of building the system. That's every iteration as you improve and change the system, right? So I think AI is an opportunity. I think it's a huge risk. It's an unknown, it's the next wave of what we're going to be working through. I don't think, it's necessarily, especially in tech, it's not going to mean necessarily reductions in the workforce, but a massive shift in the workforce, right? When we're looking at fraud prevention, the sort of skills and the way that people think about fraud prevention and access management, those things are going to need to shift because of the impact of AI.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for these perspectives and the conversation. I want to give each of you a minute to kind of wrap us up here. So just share with us one key takeaway from this discussion, and then we will announce our next webinar that's coming up. So John, would you like to kick us off with a wrap up here? Just what was one key takeaway you had from the conversation today?
We just got to make sure that your security is involved in every step when you implementing any type of capability, and have them in the loop. Because before previous organization that I worked, we reach out to security last minute. Now we have to get them involved. That's the reason when it comes to governance or life cycle management, security has to be upfront when it comes to any type of implementation.
Yeah, thank you. Roman, what is your one key takeaway from today?
It's always great to see that there's a different lessons learned and different perspectives on our challenges and discussion topics from different sectors. So it's always important to know that it's not only government agency, but there's an industry, there's a nonprofits, academia, that and there's a critical infrastructure that we have all different perspectives. So to having conversation like that, it always helps to start thinking outside of the box. So and just like the second part of the takeaway, something that I wasn't able to reflect on AI. Yeah, definitely differentiator for you as organization will be able to position yourself to harvest power AI. And because there's something that will be happening that you maybe will have to deploy techniques and methods that humanly impossible, but possibly with help of AI. So we are in new world, and we need to face that reality. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, Ross, what is one key takeaway you've got for us?
So go back to what we talked earlier about DevSecOps, and I think that is one of the keys to making sure that AI stays under control. We have to change the way we deliver systems, right? Natasha was exactly right. And then I'm gonna foot stomp that ATARC has a zero trust working group, and in that working group, in this next phase 3 lab, they're going to be doing a DevSecOps Tiger team or whatever we call it. And Natasha, that would be they need a leader like you to really put your voice in there. So that's what my final thought is here.
Oh, I love that. That's
Very
amazing.
kind. Thank you.
Wow, we're already on phase 3. Crazy. All right, Natasha, what is your key takeaway? Other than you're going to take lead on this, right?
Apparently, yeah. I think my key takeaway is that we just have to keep having these conversations. It's really easy to get sucked into your day-to-day work. Working in the digital space is incredibly stressful. But we need to be talking across industry, across government, across agencies. State and federal need to be talking to each other as much as possible. And yeah, I'm grateful for the invitation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Christopher, we will end with you, sir.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to double down on the prevention. I think one of the biggest things that people truly need to understand is if you don't know about the risks or where the risks are, how can you protect against them? Some of us have initiatives that we're moving forward. We realize where some of the risks are, but I really truly believe that prevention comes with knowing. And so look at ways in your identity stack, the identity fabric, of ways you can illuminate and find those uncover those passive privilege that maybe you don't know about. Because if you don't know about them, how can you truly protect against them? And believe it or not, as we've heard, through governance, through accounts that still exist, whether it's OAuth, whether it's machine accounts, I truly believe that that is the first step in having a rounded approach in your protecting your passive privilege. You got to uncover and know where those vulnerabilities, if you will, are at. And so lean into that, see what you can do to uncover those. And that way you'll be better informed, knowing where your risks are. And then you can actually prioritize which risks you need to remediate.
Great, thank you so much. Ending right on time at 2:30. But first, we have our last poll question up on the screen here, and it's just, do you want to receive your CPE credit? So be sure to respond to that before we end. I want to thank our partners at Beyond Trust, our amazing panelists, and the folks at home for joining us. So we look forward to seeing you at the next one, which is up on the screen. It is Zero Trust Lab 2 demonstration, and that'll be November 8th at 12 p.m. Everyone have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you at the next one.